Is it on? Yep.
Hello and welcome to Beaverdale Books. Thanks so much for joining us for the book talk. Before we begin, I have to mention a couple of our other upcoming events. This Friday at 6:30 p.m., Callie White Van Bale will talk with her latest book, Release of Information and Other Linked Stories. Callie is one of our well-known authors here. She often does the moderating for many of our events, so you may already recognize Callie. Then on Saturday, February 28th, you can stop in between 1 and 3 p.m. We're having our annual Winter Local Author Fair, and we will have 5 local authors, and you can learn all about their books. So you can find more information on our website, or you can pick up an event list from the register. Now, onto our program. Rhythm and Pep is the true story of 2 Iowa coal miners who had a dream. They put together a vaudeville dance routine that took them to the top of the entertainment world in the 1920s. It's an engaging, both sad and victorious story that includes diligence, love, hard work, and broken promises. Dan Henderson is a lifelong resident of Iowa, currently residing in Washington, Iowa. He taught history in high schools from Omaha to Des Moines and near Iowa City. And as a retired teacher, he continues to teach a class in American history at Kirkwood College. He grew up in Council Bluffs, near many of the locations mentioned in this story, and he's the grandson of Irene Pearson Henderson, who was the sister of Earl and Carl Pearson, giving him a personal connection to the narrative. In 2015, he inherited the scrapbook that Earl Pearson had kept, and it had been passed on to various family members until Dan received it and began his research. So please join me in a warm welcome for Daniel Henderson.
Thank you. Well, that was my whole introduction right there. So I can jump right into the story, can't I? Yes, my name's Dan Henderson, and I want to thank you for coming out. And if you're online, thank you for being there. As Jan said, I'm a former history teacher. I'm a historian. And you know, when a historian dresses in the period of the time they're studying, they are into the story. I started researching this story 10 years ago, and it's taken me a long time to put all the pieces together, and it really was like a puzzle. And so I'll share with you tonight a little bit of the background of the book. The book is Rhythm and Pep, Vaudeville Career of the Pearson Brothers. Now, you'll notice that there is a lovely young lady in the middle. I'll tell you about her and her involvement in this story in just a moment. But here's what happened. Again, let me introduce you to these guys. This is Earl Pearson. He was born in 1891. This is Carl Pearson, born in 1893 in Clarinda, or in the area. Their father and his brothers, so their uncles, started coal mining operations in southwest Iowa in the 1870s, right after the Civil War. And when these guys grew up in Clarinda, of course, they didn't go to high school because no one expected them to. They went into the coal mines and began mining coal by the early 1900s anyway. Earl had a different idea. He was not happy mining coal. Now, by the way, these 2 guys are my grandmother's brothers. So their father is my great-grandfather who started the coal mines. So that's my personal connection to this story. And when I was a young kid growing up in Council Bluffs, we would go to Harrison County, Iowa, which, if you know where that is, it's just north of Council Bluffs. And that's where my family came from. And my grandmother lived there. Now, Earl died in 1959. I was 4 years old, so I don't know if I had met him or not. But my aunts and uncles did. And when we went up there, we heard stories about Earl and Carl and their traipsing across the United States on the vaudeville circuit. And I saw this scrapbook big, huge scrapbook, like leather bound. And they, and as a kid, I just didn't pay much attention to it. But I knew the story. I knew that they were famous. And after they talked about it a while, I went out and climbed a tree or something, Wasn't that interested. But over the years, of course, as I became a history teacher and interested in family history, the story kept coming back. And we would have family reunions after my grandmother, everybody passed away, but aunts and uncles and cousins, we all had family reunions, and this scrapbook kept popping up. There it was. Well, it went from Earl to his sister, my grandmother. She had it until 1984 when she passed away. She handed it off to her daughter, my aunt, who was living in Iowa. She had it until 2015. She gave it to me in 2015. She was 93 or 4 at the time. And she knew of my interest in history and family history, and she said, "Here, I want you to have this." And I took it because I knew at that point how precious it was. And I told her, I promised her, I will do something with this. I don't know what exactly yet, but I'll do something with it. Well, this is what I did with it. I wrote a book. Now, from 2015, what this scrapbook contained was unbelievable amount of information about their career. There were show reviews. There were contracts from the Orpheum Circuit. There was letters and telegraphs and photos, of course. And at the time, it was just a mishmash. And as I looked at it, I said, there's a story running through this somewhere, and I've got to find out what that story is. So I started digging into online archives of newspapers from the 19-teens and the 1920s. And these guys were all over those newspapers in Clarinda and other places around the country. I started going into Variety and Billboard magazines from that era. They were all over the place. So I took all of that information along with the scrapbook, and I outlined and retraced their whole career from about 1915, and they stayed active until 1945, at the end of World War II. Now, having said all that, let me tell you a little bit more about how they started out. They started out in Clarinda, Iowa. Clarinda is just a little town, but it actually had quite a vibrant, at that time, and I'm talking early 1900s, a vibrant entertainment community. They had Opera House. We talked about the Holly Opera House. Later on, a guy came to the community, name escapes me now, but they built another theater for his band. He was a bandmaster. And they built another theater. That one escapes my mind too. I'm having a blank. But anyway, there were a couple of different theaters in the town. Then there was also a very, very vibrant Chautauqua movement. If you're familiar with Chautauqua, it was a very, very, it was a nationwide movement in the early 1900s in rural areas that would actually, they would put on a week-long program. And it was preaching, it was politics, it was theater, it was music, and it was all outdoors. They built a pavilion for Chautauqua in Clarinda. It's long gone, but they had a pavilion there. These guys were exposed to all of that theater. And only about 80 miles away in Omaha, there was a vaudeville theater. And so I can imagine that with the trains running through there, they may have had an opportunity to go to Omaha and visit the Orpheum Theater, which is still there. Now, the other influence on them, of course, was coal mining. I mentioned their coal mining operation. So, Earl just hated coal mining, apparently. And so, by the time, about 1910, he decided, I'm getting out of here. He had a friend named Shorty McCord in town. And they had already been performing at the Holly Opera House doing stunts and acrobatics and this kind of thing. And all of a sudden, a traveling theater company came through called the Deming Theater Company. And a theater company in those days would go from town to town, and they would spend about a week in each small town. Didn't matter how big or small the town was. If they had a theater, they were going to perform. And they put on a different show every night. It's like binge watching, right? You go every night, you get a different show. But in between the acts of the play, they would do full plays. They would have vaudeville entertainers, and they would just do all kinds of things. So Deming Theater Company hired on Earl and his buddy Shorty, and they were traveling throughout Iowa and Midwest until Shorty fell in love with the leading lady in the troupe, and they ran off. Oh. And so Earl didn't have a partner anymore, and so Earl decided, I've got to have a dance partner. They were doing this acrobatic dancing routine. Initially, by the way, they were doing it on roller skates across the stage, flips, tumbling, all to music. So if you think about that scene in your mind, you can probably imagine what it looked like. Well, Earl goes back to Clarinda, and he's decided he's going to get Carl out of the coal mines. So I want to read you a quick section about what that conversation might have been like, because I don't have the exact words, but I do have some bits and pieces about what happened in that coal mine that I know he convinced his brother to come out. So here's a section in the early part of the book. Knowing the coal mines well, Earl descended into one of the shafts to find Carl. He found Carl filling a cart with coal. He was sweaty, dirty, wearing a hard hat. Carl was well suited for working in the mines, being shorter in stature than his older brother. He probably would have stayed in the mining industry if not for this fateful day in 1915. So Earl says, Carl, I just got back from the tour with the Deming Theater Company, and Shorty married the leading lady, and they took off, so I'm without a partner. Carl, without breaking his word, sorry to hear that, Earl. I knew Shorty was unreliable. Earl, well, I've come back home to get you out of the mines, little brother. I need a new dance partner, and I want you to come with me. Carl straightens up his head, still not touching the cavern ceiling. And his look is of one of disbelief. Earl continues and insists, you don't want to spend the rest of your life here in these mines, do you? Carl just as insistently barks back, Earl, there is no way. You know I can't dance. It ain't gonna happen. Carl, shaking his head, begins to turn back to his shovel, the dirty coal pile in front of him, and the back-breaking work ahead. Now Earl becomes more insistent and says, Carl, what is the most you can make shoveling coal in these mines? $50 a week? Maybe. And how long will you be able to do that? You'll be bent over and washed up by the time you are 30. Earl sets up his final plea. Carl, I know you can do this. I've seen you at the dance at the local school, and you are good. You've got some moves. But did you know that people in show business can make 3 or 4 times what you are making in this coal mine? And if we become really good and famous, we could probably make 10 times more. Carl, still shaking his head, looks up at his taller brother, who is bent over so his head won't hit the cavern ceiling. I don't know, Earl. I'm not very good at ... We don't know how long the conversation lasted, but what was clear is that Earl eventually convinced his younger brother to join him. It was a pivotal moment in their lives where taking this risk had major consequences. The risk they took would shape their lives for the next 30 years. Now, here's what we also know. What happened next, Earl and Carl found an old barn outside Clarinda near Shenandoah, just east of the train depot, according to Earl, and that's where they practiced their routine. There, among the hay bales and farm equipment, and probably with cows watching, the two boys developed an acrobatic dance routine. It was the fall of 1915, and they practiced their acrobatic dance moves day and night in the barn. How much more rural Iowa can you get? What the two boys could not predict, though it was only a dream at the time, was that by 1920, within 5 years, they would be performing at the famous Vaudeville Palace Theater in New York City for thousands of people. And a year later, for President Woodrow Wilson. So, 5-year period, they start practicing this acrobatic dance routine. And they actually do their first vaudeville performance in Essex, Iowa. You know where Essex is. No one else knows where Essex is. You know where it is? Okay. Essex, little town north of Shenandoah. But they have an opera house there. And Earl and Carl convinced the manager to let them perform. The manager was a little bit skeptical. They packed the house 3 nights in a row. The manager was quite pleased, needless to say. But the Deming Theater Company was back in the area at that point, and they picked up Carl and Earl again. So in 1916, 17, they're out with the Deming Theater Company. Now, this is very fortuitous as well, because the Deming Theater Company had a young pianist by the name of Cleo Newport. She was born in Kansas about 1895. She was a personality plus, talented young woman, and she could sing, she could dance. She was part of the group. Earl and Cleo fell in love. Now, they didn't leave the troupe like his buddy Shorty did. They stayed with the troupe. They got married on the road out in Wyoming somewhere. They were performing. And what they did is they incorporated Cleo into their act as the accompanist. And she added a spark of personality that just absolutely amazed everybody, and probably them as well. They were good. She made them better. By 1918, they actually were picked up by another tent theater company. Now, if you're not familiar with tent theaters, there is a museum in Mount Pleasant committed or dedicated to tent theater troupes that used to travel all through the Midwest. And they were sort of like a traveling theater company, only they set up tents. All right, so they were mainly performing in the warm months of the year. The theater companies performing in opera houses were performing in the winter because it was too cold to be outside. So the theater company was actually out of Newton, Iowa. It's called the Chase Lister Tent Theater Company. And they actually had launched several famous vaudevillians. And so the 3 of them, they were known then as the Pearson Trio, began to perform with Chase Lister. By late 1918, the 3 decided it's time for us to go for the big bookings. They went to Chicago, tried out on the Orpheum, what was known then as the Keith Orpheum Circuit Theater. And they were hired. They were that good. They got a 65-week contract, which meant they could travel. They had steady work for whatever number of years that is. And they started their touring in the West. They actually sent them out west. They did perform here in Iowa, so they performed at there is where there used to be, a Orpheum Theater in downtown Des Moines on 8th. Yeah, 8th Street. It's gone. But they performed there. They performed in Sioux City. They performed in Dubuque. They performed Omaha. They performed all over the Midwest. Then they sent them out west to perform in L.A., San Francisco, Portland, Seattle. And so what I want to do is read you, during that first year, a couple of the reviews of their act. Because within a year, they were already being noticed and reaching higher and higher heights of recognition. So during that first year of touring, here are a couple, I'll just read a couple reviews. Hang on a second. And I don't know which cities these are from, but they're all out west. By this point, they're going by Pearson, Newport, and Pearson. So they're no longer the Pearson Trio. She was good enough, I think, they recognized they needed to give her equal billing. So they did. She was Pearson, Newport, Pearson. So here's the first one. Pearson, Newport, Pearson might well head any vaudeville bill. with their act, in which they present a little music, a little step dancing, and a whole lot of pep, calling forth more than their share of applause. They present a line of acrobatic step dancing that has rarely been equaled on this circuit. Here's another one. The overwhelming verdict based on the applause made Newport Pearson the outstanding favorite of the bill. This trio consists of 2 men and a woman, and the latter opening in a dance turn with the men, but doing the rest of her work at the piano. The men do the cleverest, eccentric, and knockabout dancing turn ever seen on the stage of the Grand Theater somewhere. One more. I think this one was in L.A. because it's a hippodrome. The Pearson Trio are making a hit at the hippodrome with their acrobatic buck dancing. The two boys do some hair-raising stunts in connection with their dancing, such as diving over tables and boxes and turning flips and somersaults in time with the music. The girl plays a Patriot song. So this is what they became known for. Acrobatic, almost call it gymnastic dancing to the music, and every step was in absolute rhythm. Now, if you think of the music of that time, it was ragtime. It was jazz. So it's not like music of today. But it was, you heard the word pep in there. They came to be known, or they called their routine a study in pep for the first 3 or 4 years. And in vaudeville, here's what you could get away with. You could do the same routine every night for 3 years because you're in a different place. And no one had ever seen it before. So they did. They traveled the whole circuit. Now, eventually, they will end up in New York. They break into what's called the big time by 1920, 1921. And they perform on the Palace Theater, or at the Palace Theater. Now, the Palace Theater was built in 1915 by Martin Beck. Martin Beck owned the Orpheum Circuit, which included about 60 theaters across the country. So when you signed on with the Orpheum Circuit, you had, that many different theaters you could visit. The palace was designed in Greek architecture to be the most fantastic, ornate, beautiful theater. Of course, it was in New York. And it became the pinnacle of success. If you performed at the palace, you had reached the height of vaudeville success. This trio performed there 6 times, but in the 1920s. The year after their first performance, they went to Washington, D.C. and played at the Keith Orpheum Theater in Washington for President Wilson. Here's the review of the performance they did for President Wilson that night, 1921. Now, they're still young, new on the circuit. So they're billed, a lot of times when you're starting out in vaudeville, you were billed in an inferior position on the bill, maybe at the beginning. Didn't take long before they worked their way into better positions, but they're still in the lower positions at this point. So the review reads, although billed in an inferior way, the artists who received the greatest individual applause were Pearson, Newport, and Pearson, a trio of dance and solo wizards. The two male members of the novelty are unquestionably the best tiptoe dancers any Keith agent has ever sent here. And the young lady handles her role at the piano very well. This act is new on the Keith circuit, but it should long be a popular event. The act demonstrates that something new can always be added to dancing. Certainly, Pearson, Newport, Pearson has spoken the last word here in their terpsichorean eccentricity. You get what those words mean. The number was billed a study in pep. Now, the scrapbook has over 200 reviews like this. Every one of them are just glowing. And the Billboard reviews were the same. They're just all fantastic reviews. So this trio performed through the 1920s. Now here's the problem. By 1926, radio hit the scene. People, see, vaudeville was a communal experience where everyone in the neighborhood had to go together down to the theater, the local neighborhood theater, to see the stars. Now, you could sit in your front room with a radio and listen to Burns and Allen, or some of the other ones, Jack Benny. Some of those names you may or may not know, depending on your age. My daughter may not know some of those names. I was doing this. I talked about Abbott and Costello in one place, and this young lady looked at me with blank space. Who's Abbott and Costello?
I know that one.
I about lost it. But anyway, they performed with some of the greats, so they were on the same bill with a lot of these people: Burns and Allen, Jack Benny, Houdini, Eva Tanguay. If you know who she is, she was the highest paid performer in vaudeville. She was so good, she would earn $10,000 per performance in the 1920s. Now, these guys obviously didn't earn that kind of money, but they did do well. The average vaudevillian, and there were thousands of them at that time, might earn $150 per performance. That was average. Eva Tanguay obviously wasn't average. By the end of the mid-20s, they were earning $600 a night. Now, $600 in today's money is $8,000. So they were earning, if you think about that, Meredith knows what entertainment is. We'll talk about that in a minute. $8,000 for one performance. Now, you have to take into account that vaudevillians had to pay for their own railroad tickets. Every night is in a hotel. You pay for your own food. There's no perks. There's no expense account in vaudeville. They don't do that. So the money could disappear very quickly. And unfortunately, the money disappeared very quickly because Earl developed a really bad habit of drinking. And so a lot of his money went to that, and that's going to end up causing a rift and a kind of a collapse of the group by the late 1920s. But by the late 1920s, talking movies had also come into being by 1927, Jazz Singer. And that was the end, almost the end of vaudeville with talking movies. Now, I'm not going to go any further in the story because that's only about halfway through the book. These guys, even after they have these personal challenges, vaudeville is collapsing, movies are taking over, they find a way to stay on the stage for another 15 years through the Great Depression and through World War II. So I'm not going to go into that side of the story because you'll have to buy the book to find out. But it's a fun story, and I actually dedicate one full chapter to Cleo, because she was so instrumental to their success, and they knew it. But even without her, she left the group in 1927 or 8 because of Earl's drinking. And the rest of her life was just so interesting. So I traced what happened to her, and it's an interesting story, to say the least. So this book really has been a labor of love for me. And as I learned not only about them, but about the whole vaudeville industry, I realized what I was learning about is how my grandparents and great-grandparents' generation received entertainment. You know, we receive entertainment now with our phones and televisions and computers and streaming, but they didn't have any of that in vaudeville. It was all live performance all the time. That was how you were entertained, unless you entertained yourself at home. So I kept working and putting together this story, and finally last fall, the book was published. It was published in November last year. And I've been on this whirlwind tour through Iowa, started in Clarinda and Shenandoah, and I've been a lot of other places. I've got tons of events coming up between now and May. But the other part of the story I want to tell you about is really, really important to me because it's another family connection. And that has to do with my daughter. This is Meredith Henderson here. Her stage name is Morgana Moon. And I don't know what year it was you heard about this story. Do you remember?
Yeah, no. It was when we first started doing presentations about it at the library down in Washington.
Okay, so that would have been late, like 2019, 2020, 21.
Yeah.
She kind of caught the spirit of this story. And when she moved to Des Moines here, a number of years ago, she started a variety theater show production company called Rhythm and Pep. And so now it's been going for 3 years, and she has been putting on variety show, vaudeville type entertainment over here at XBK and other places, I think. And she was so enamored with the story that she wanted to kind of continue, I guess, the family line. Now, the way I like to describe it is this generation and the next generation, which would be my father's generation, had a real entertainment gene. My father was a saxophonist, did dance bands all across the Midwest. He had his own band, Jack Henderson Band, traveled all over the place. Well, I think that entertainment gene skipped my generation. And then it went right into my kids' generation, because Meredith is a fantastic singer. You should hear her sing if you haven't. Go to XBK sometime and you will. She has a band too, a band that performs. But I'm so gratified by the fact that she's kind of picked up that entertainment bug, I guess, if nothing else, or desire. And so she's carrying on the story. So that's terrific. Now, I'll finish up. If you have questions, actually, I've got one more reading I want to do. Am I okay on time?
You're fine.
Okay. This is, at the end of the story, I write a kind of an epilogue, which is a personal tribute to the Pearson Trio. And I'll just read a paragraph or two of it, because as I studied this career and this story, I began to make some real strong connections to today, where we are as human beings, because such a human story. And human beings, over time, probably don't change all that much. Culture does, technology does, but people are people. So here's a tribute to them that I thought about. The Pearson brothers represent an era long past, yet in many ways it remains close to our lives today. The live stage performance with audience interaction and the excitement of a new or novelty act continues to draw people into a community of awe and wonder. We still admire the gymnastic skill of athletes like Simone Biles and other great Olympians who fly through the air with the ease that defies gravity. We are not so different from those early 20th century audiences, or from our grandparents and great-grandparents who were amazed by humanity's ability to tame nature and gravity, conquer the unconquered, and anticipate the uncertain outcome of an acrobatic movement through time and space in perfect pep and rhythm with the music. Somehow, it matches the beat of our hearts and our human spirit, and it will never go out of style. So vaudeville, if you don't know anything about vaudeville, we still have it today. It's still around. Even on television, if you watch Saturday Night Live, that's the remnant of old vaudeville entertainment, and a lot of live shows. And actually, vaudeville is making a comeback in some big cities where they actually have vaudeville clubs that are reopening. Cincinnati has one, New York certainly. So there's something about that entertainment that just, I think, will never die. And so with that, I'll tell you. Let me throw it open to questions, and then I'll tell you about a couple other books I've written. And by the way, I want to thank Jan for having me. And this bookstore is such a gem. I understand they're expanding. We're going to knock out that wall. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's going to make this place much bigger. But Jan, they gratefully they carry all my books here, and I appreciate that. So Any questions about this story?
Didn't they have interesting names that they went by?
Yes. This was Humpy. This was Tots. He was known as Tots. I don't think Cleo had any kind of strange name, but the local people, the local townspeople in Clarinda, and I don't know why they came up with those names, but he was known as Humpy and Tots. And they did go by those names during the Great Depression. They actually, and again, that's a part of the story I didn't talk about, but they hooked up with another team, and they went by Humpy and Tots instead of Earl and Carl.
Yeah.
Question?
What was the biggest surprise you found in the research that you did? Was there anything?
Surprise. Well, one of the big surprises, it wasn't so much about them because I knew that story, but it was about vaudeville itself and how pervasive it was. So vaudeville really kind of came on the scene around 1880s, and it grew out of earlier performance art forms like saloon shows and what they call dime museums, circuses. Those were all around, but there was no national mass entertainment network yet. And so in around 1880, a guy by the name of Tony Pastor, he wanted to do something different, and he wanted to make it family friendly, because most of the theater, quote, saloon theaters, were not a place you would take children in or your wife. It was bawdy, it was, nasty. So he said, I'm going to put on a family friendly show and invite women in, and they can bring the kids, bring the family, and it was a hit. I mean, it just took off like wildfire. So by 1900, vaudeville theaters were everywhere, and it became a national mass entertainment industry. The two guys so what surprised me was how much money was involved in it. It was massive, millions and millions and millions of dollars. And this is before TV, before radio, before any of that, mechanism to make money. They were making tons of money through vaudeville. And now, the other thing that I discovered is at the height of vaudeville was probably between 1915 and 1920, right toward the end of World War I. But there were around 2,000 theaters spread across the country on these circuits. And there were the estimate is, that I've seen from scholars, is there were about 20,000 different performers that performed in vaudeville, 20,000 in that period. And I thought to myself, because most of them are long gone, we don't even know who they are, right? You know who they are if they're a George Burns or a, Houdini or someone like that, because a lot of the really famous ones went into radio and movies. Fred Astaire, big names. Most of them didn't. These guys did not make that crossover to radio or movies. That's why their story was lost. I was lucky. So the thing that amazed me was I found this scrapbook. How many scrapbooks are out there? How many lost, suitcases with memorabilia have been out there, still out there, ready to be found, or maybe they've been thrown out and burned. I mean, that's the sad part, is so many of these vaudevillians. In fact, I dedicate this book to all of those lost vaudevillians. If I can find the dedication page. Here it is. It says, to all the unknown or forgotten vaudevillians of history, may your stories be remembered and told. So I was kind of amazed by the numbers and how big it really was. Now, an interesting story about how vaudeville ended is because of movies. And a guy by the name of Joseph P. Kennedy decided in 1928 that movies were the thing of the future. And they were. He bought out Keith Orpheum Circuits, and he began the process of transforming them into movie houses. And the new program, or the new company, was called RKO. So if you're familiar with RKO Entertainment, that was a Kennedy program to begin with, and he paid $28 million for these theaters, or something like that. And but that was sort of the end. Even the Palace Theater, vaudeville theater, switched to all films by 1932. No more vaudeville, you know. But these guys found a way to keep going and performing, and even in their advanced age, I talk about advanced age, they would have been in their late 40s, they were still doing acrobatic dance routines and getting great reviews. I mean, I think in my late 40s, I could, you know, if I sat down too long, I can hardly get up, you know. But these guys were doing it, and had a great career. So, any other questions? Well, real quick, I've got 3 other books. So I retired in 2022 from teaching, kind of retired, yeah, there were quotes. But I had a plan, and my plan was I was going to do all the writing that I've been wanting to do my whole life, except for kids come along, and I had a profession to do, and, you know, things happen. So in 2022, I published actually 2 books. This one was my first one, which is more of a spiritual journey memoir. It's called Confessions of a Recovering Evangelical, and I know you have it here. That one really has been a great seller for me. It's on Amazon, and gosh, they still send me a check every once in a while for that one, so it's kind of nice. The second one grew out of that, was called The Spiritual Journey to Anti-Racism, which is my story of dealing with growing up in white Iowa and absorbing a white supremacist mentality without even my permission, giving my permission. It was there. It's just part of the framework that we grow up in. So coming to terms with that and understanding it was kind of a journey, a spiritual journey that I took. This one, actually, my publisher said, "Hey, we're writing a book. We're pulling together authors on, and the name of the book is The Unchristian Truth About White Christian Nationalism." I said, "Oh, I know about that. I can tell you about that." So I contributed a chapter here. It's about education, what I know best. And so that book is available. Now I've got another one that will come out this fall, which is called the Reflections of a Recovered Evangelical. So it's kind of an update to this one, kind of new stuff, and it's got a lot of warnings in it about what I'm seeing in terms of Christian nationalism today and what's happening in our country and even globally. So it's coming out. I'll have to talk to you about coming back for that one,
Okay.
I guess. So,
Yeah.
But they're all available here. So buy local. Don't go to Amazon. They're on Amazon, but buy them local. And I think you'll enjoy it. But thanks for coming. And I'll stick around if anybody does want to buy the book. I know,
We'll
you guys
have-
already have one, so, you know.
Those other 2, though.
We'll have signed copies.
You'll have signed copies. Yep.
Yeah. All right.
So, all right. Thanks
Thank
a lot.
you.
Hope you enjoyed. Here's the new